We've got a bit of a 4th of July themed gun law video today as we talk about why the AR-15 isn't protected by the Second Amendment. Wait, that doesn't sound very free, does it? Allow me to explain. So what is an AR-15 and why isn't it protected by the Second Amendment? For those of you who might be tuning into my content for the first time, the AR-15 was invented by Eugene Stoner in the 1960s, adopted by the U.S. military, where it's been in service for 6 decades. However, unlike the military versions of this rifle, civilian AR-15s are semi-automatic. I said semi-automatic, not fully automatic, not the same thing. One trigger pull, one shot, semi-automatic. It's chambered in .223, which is a very small round, unsuitable for most forms of hunting because, contrary to what you might hear on the news, it's typically too weak to be a reliable performer to hunt game like deer. It uses interchangeable magazines, typically 20 to 30 rounds each, but you can get larger and smaller mags. By most estimates, there are approximately 20 million AR-15s in the U.S. today. I just got back from Boston last week where I threw replica tea into a not replica Boston harbor, meaning that my balls are swollen with freedom and liberty, and I want to talk to you about the Revolutionary War. Bear with me. I'm going to make a point eventually. Two of the most common arms during the war for American independence were the Brown Bess musket and the Kentucky long rifle. The Brown Bess was a British flintlock musket, one of the most common firearms used by both British troops and American colonists. It was a smoothbore musket known for its reliability and commonality. The Kentucky long rifle was a superior American innovation. Unlike the Bess, it used a rifled barrel which gave it better range and accuracy. The important point here is that civilians and militiamen had the same access to the same rifles as regular soldiers. There was no distinction between what the military used and what was available to civilians. For that matter, before the war, colonies like Massachusetts and Virginia even had laws requiring all able-bodied civilians to have a long gun and ammo. If you didn't, you could be fined up to 10 shillings. 10 shillings is half a pound. Adjusted for inflation, that's about $65,000. So if your tricorn hat-wearing ass got caught around town without a strap, you would be fined the equivalent of a 1772 model Ford F-150 horse-drawn carriage extended cab. So where am I going with this nonsense? Stick with me. We're getting to the point. In 1986, the Firearms Owners Protection Act included something called the Hughes Amendment, which banned the manufacture of new machine guns for civilian use, effectively banning the full auto M16, the version of the AR-15 used by the military. At that point, we could only own semi-auto AR-15s. Then, 1994, the assault weapons ban specifically targeted features of the AR-15 like flash hiders, threaded barrels, magazines in excess of 10 rounds, and even collapsing stocks, moving us further away from the military's M16. This ban sunset in 2004, and since then, individual states have enacted their own regulations, with some states continuing to ban or heavily regulate the AR-15. Where does the AR-15 presently sit, legally speaking, in relation to the Second Amendment? Surely, the most conservative Supreme Court in recent memory would find the AR-15 is protected by the Second Amendment, right? In District of Columbia v. Heller, 2008, the Supreme Court held that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to possess a firearm for lawful purposes such as self-defense within the home. The court used both historical context and the common use standard to interpret the Second Amendment. They looked at the historical context of the right to keep and bear arms and emphasized that weapons in common use at the time are protected under the Second Amendment. While the decision focused on handguns, it set a precedent for understanding what types of firearms are protected, leaving the door open for further interpretation regarding weapons like the AR-15. But unfortunately, the AR-15 has remained in limbo and doesn't expressly enjoy Second Amendment protection. Quite the opposite, if anything. The Supreme Court has tacitly deprived the AR-15 of Second Amendment protection not just once, but 3 times in the past 7 years, and once this week alone. In Colby v. Hogan, 2017, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld Maryland's ban on assault rifles, including the AR-15. The court ruled that these weapons are like military weapons and therefore not protected by the Second Amendment. To me, that's kind of the point. The Second Amendment pretty expressly protects guns that are like military weapons, at least more so than anything else. The Supreme Court denied certiorari, meaning that they chose not to review the case, leaving the lower court's decision in place. Warman v. Healy, the First Circuit Court of Appeals upheld Massachusetts' ban on the AR-15, and again, the Supreme Court denied certiorari, declining to take up that case and leaving it standing. But even this week, just 2 days ago, the Supreme Court refused to hear a challenge to Illinois' assault weapons ban. This inaction left the ban in place, and it signaled that the Supreme Court, is going to refuse to consider the AR-15 as protected by the Second Amendment. If we look at historical context, which is the new standard for interpreting the Second Amendment, we can see that civilians and military personnel had access to the same firearms. The Second Amendment, which was created in peacetime after the Revolutionary War, doesn't distinguish between wartime and peacetime rights. The express wording and the context don't suggest that the Second Amendment scope should be wider or narrower based on external factors like the current state of conflict. But here's where the logical issue comes in. Many debates about the AR-15 and the Second Amendment don't address the core issue. Pro-gun and anti-gun advocates argue about whether the Second Amendment protects the AR-15 when, in my opinion, it quite clearly does. The argument really that we should be having is whether we should have a Second Amendment, or at least the version we have now. The current debate is known in logic as a category mistake. That's arguing over a different issue that's not really the core question. If we agree on the clear interpretation that the Second Amendment, based on historical context and common use, protects the AR-15, we can have a more productive debate about whether or not the Second Amendment itself is needed or something we still want to maintain as a country. This approach would allow for a clearer, more focused discussion on the real issue at hand. Now, restated one more time, as someone who's worked in the gun industry for 20 years, a lawyer admitted since 2009, 3 states, the 9th, 11th, and 5th Federal Circuit, it's clear to me that under the current historical context standard, the AR-15 deserved more protection than pistols or shotguns, which have been ruled to be protected. The Second Amendment isn't about hunting, and for sure the Supreme Court has expanded the Second Amendment to the individual right of personal protection and to handguns, but facially the Second Amendment itself is about civil defense and the ability for the people to protect themselves from an oppressive government, whether that government is British or Democrat or Republican, the Empire, the Principality of Zion, whatever. If the Second Amendment protected only one gun today, the AR-15, the modern day equivalent of the muskets used by our forefathers, would be it. And I think we can all agree that these men 250 years ago would have anticipated that firearms technology would have advanced to where it is today when they made the Second Amendment. After all, the Revolutionary War itself saw one of the most significant technological advances in small arms, the introduction of the rifle with the rifled barrel, quickly rendering the musket obsolete. Accordingly, no matter what our beliefs are about gun control, we should all acknowledge that the AR-15 is one gun protected by the Second Amendment. After that, it's a lot easier to handle the debate over whether or not we should have the Second Amendment instead of half-assing this debate, relying on the whims of politicians and appointed conservative or liberal activist judges to interpret the Second Amendment vaguely and inconsistently and against the clear wording. The standard is looking at it historically, the historical context, and to me, this clearly supports the protection of the AR-15, the modern-day Kentucky long rifle, under the Second Amendment. And yeah, while this video kind of touched on some political issues, I tried to keep it apolitical. This is my personal channel, but I still adhere to the guns not politics motto of the Firearm blog here. We're all free to believe what we want to believe, which is what's so great about this country. I just would rather see the debate focused on the correct issue. And while we're on that subject, remember, we are free to disagree. And this country is divided right now down the middle with political ideologies. I don't know about you, but I don't have the energy to hate half the people I run into every day. So today of all days, be kind to your fellow Americans and happy 4th of July, everyone. Except for you, England. You guys go fuck yourselves. I'm kidding. I love you English guys too.